I'm Pat Doris. Welcome to The Story. I hope you're doing well. I'm just back from a week of vacation. It was so exciting that I organized my sock drawer. No kidding. It is so good to be back. We have a great show for you tonight. We're talking about a nasty little beetle that can kill our oak trees and some updates involving Measure 110. But first, we're going to talk about a budget battle that's brewing in Multnomah County over something called a sobering center. That's our big story tonight. 3 years ago, Portland's only sobering center closed for good. Since about 1970, it was a place where police and firefighters could take folks who were too drunk for their own good, and they could basically sleep it off in a safe place. But over time, the folks who ended up there were not just drunks. Some had mental illness, and some were about to overdose on drugs, and some had aggressive behaviors, and some were just psychotic. So in 2020, the place closed. And since then, most of the people who used to go there now end up in hospital emergency rooms or jails, or maybe sometimes they're just left on the streets. It's why County Commissioner Julia Brim Edwards says a new sobering center is an urgent need.
It's very much needed. In fact, the last year it was in operation in 2019. More than 5,000 people received services, really to keep them safe and also to keep our neighborhood safe. When people are in crisis, they need someplace to go, and it needs to be open 24/7.
Brim Edwards said she's talked with police and firefighters and Portland street response folks, and all agree that the city needs a place where people in crisis can be taken, where they are safe and where the community is safe as well. Commissioner Sharon Myron agrees.
A sobering center is urgently needed, and that's not coming from my perspective as an elected official. It's coming from my perspective as an ER doctor who regularly sees people with addiction issues coming into the emergency department, and as a volunteer with Portland Street Medicine, going out and providing medical care to people living outside.
Okay, well, that sounds pretty simple, eh? I guess we're getting a sobering center. Well, wait a minute. Multnomah County, not so much. Multnomah County is deciding tomorrow how to spend an extra $60 million in tax money that it did not expect to have when it drew up the current budget. So you would think that it's a no-brainer, but oh no, it's not. Turns out the county chair, Jessica Vega-Peterson, has zero money set aside for a sobering center in her proposal on how to spend that $60 million. Instead, she's spent the money on things for people after they've gone through that crisis. It would include things like a 30 to 60-day stabilization center for people leaving drug withdrawal programs or sobering programs, short-term transitional housing with recovery services, and recovery-oriented permanent supportive housing. I wanted to talk with the chair, Jessica Vega-Peterson, about this today, but she was not made available. However, the Oregonian newspaper reported that Vega-Peterson believes her plan will fill an important need. And it quotes a statement from her as reading, "The holes we are plugging with a stabilization center, transitional housing, and recovery-oriented housing are key investments, and they come on top of our healthcare partners bringing online 17 sobering beds. With these investments, we can move people from crisis into care and onto stability, both immediately and longer term." A statement early this evening also came to us from her office and suggested the move is supported by a large committee that recommended funding those back-end services first. The committee is called Beacon. Vega-Peterson's plan would cost about $13 million. Brim Edwards and Myron, the other two commissioners who want the sobering center, they estimate their plan would cost between $10 and $15 million. And they hope for more money from the city of Portland to kind of match what they're putting in from the county. Both will argue for it tomorrow during the county board meeting. Brim Edwards says she hopes other commissioners will join in and support them.
And I know that having talked to my colleagues is none of us wants the options to be for somebody in crisis to be jail, to be left on the street, or to send them to the ER room, because those aren't places where they're going to get the services they really need.
Going back to what you were saying about the front door, I think to most viewers, it's just an obvious thing. You need to have a place to take these people. It's not right to take them to the hospital or to leave them on the street or throw them in jail. And yet a city of our size does not have this. How can that be?
Well, we did have it in the 90s. Approximately 15,000 people a year had the benefit of a sobering center. In fact, as recently as 2019, about 5,000 people a year had the benefit of keeping, really keeping them safe and our communities safe. And so, during the pandemic and the aftermath of that, as we come out of recovery, it absolutely makes total sense to be looking at how do we restore this very critical need.
So we'll be watching to see how these things shake out and how Multnomah County decides to spend its extra tax money. It's all going to happen tomorrow. In the meantime, what do you think? Do you think a sobering center is needed first, or do you agree with the chair's proposal for resources on the back end? Let us know, will you? You're great about sending us your thoughts and email. The address for the email is thestory@kgw.com. If you don't want to email, you could also call and leave a voicemail. That number is 503-226-5090. Now, let's turn our attention to Measure 110, which decriminalized user amounts of all street drugs, including things like meth and fentanyl. Many of you, I know, think 110 is a complete failure. It needs to either be repealed completely or at least changed in a way to recriminalize possession of hard drugs. And you're not alone. Some of the biggest names in Oregon business, Phil Knight, Tim Boyle, Jordan Schnitzer, have all given money to a new effort to put the fate of 110 in front of voters next fall. That is, if the legislature doesn't do anything about it in the early part of next year during the special short session. But there are still plenty of people around Oregon who think that 110 just needs more time to show how effective it can be. The rollout of the first diverted cannabis tax money was a delayed mess, and it only happened about a year ago. That was long after voters approved it back in 2020. That means that some programs to help people dealing with addiction are really just getting underway. And those programs are what should be used to help addicts instead of throwing them into jail, say advocates. According to 110 advocates, new data released today by the Oregon Health Authority shows that, you know what, maybe the initial growing pains of 110 are being worked out. Let's start with this graph showing the number of people being served across the state in programs that receive Measure 110 money. It's important to note that these numbers represent actual clients instead of someone just walking in and asking about services but not getting any help. The bars represent quarters 1, 2, and 3. Quarter 1 on the left was last summer between July and the end of September. Quarter 2 between October and the end of the year. Quarter 3 from January through March of this year. You can see the numbers have been steadily growing, with most people using peer support services and harm reduction. Shown as a change in percentages from quarter 1 to quarter 3, and all those green arrows are certainly welcome sights to Measure 110 advocates. In this case, green is good. It's also important to point out that the numbers lack context because they don't really tell us how many people were getting treatment before Measure 110 money started to roll out. That would be a true comparison of whether the law is making an impact. But we can say that compared to when the money first started to roll out, that more people are now getting more help. So let's talk about that money. We're getting a look at how it's being spent by providers once they receive Measure 110 grants. Here's another graph. It's a night of graphs. Aren't you loving that? Here's another graph showing you those 3 quarters from before. Most of the money is going towards peer support and housing services, though it is worth noting that substance use disorder spending actually went down at the beginning of the year. And here's a breakdown of the types of spending. More than a third is going toward personnel, another third for capital. So yeah, 2/3 personnel and capital, while services and supplies are next at 19%. Now, OHA says the expenditures largely reflect early infrastructure and personnel costs that come with setting up a new program like this. Those are the growing pains that we mentioned before. But even with the funds moving, there are still some issues with who is getting that money and the accountability, or should we say lack thereof, that comes along with that. To illustrate that, we think a recent article by our friends at the Oregon Capital Chronicle is worth your time. This article was written by Ben Botkin and published last night. The headline gives you the gist. State ends 2 Measure 110 grants this month over misuse of funds, failure to provide services. The Oregon Health Authority was alerted to problems by former employee complaints, not from its own oversight. Since Measure 110 money started going out last year, more than $260 million has gone to more than 230 programs across the state. That is a lot of money. And as the drama over Measure 110 heats up, there are all kinds of stories to be told.
Well, really, there's been a lot of increasing attention focused on Measure 110 lately, just in terms of drug addiction and concern about that and concern about the role Measure 110 plays. So as part of my reporting, I really wanted to dig deeper into Measure 110 and how that program's doing. And really finding it was very easy. It was really just a matter of looking at meeting agendas, seeing that it was on the Oversight Council's agenda, and then requesting records and further documentation to get more details.
Good, straightforward reporting. Well done, sir. Botkin's reporting shows that not every group that's getting 110 money is using it the way that they should be. And that includes $1.2 million given to two programs, one in Portland, the other in Ontario in Malheur County. Those providers, as they are called, have to submit quarterly reports about their spending and how many people they're serving. Then OHA staff look for discrepancies. But in these two recent cases, plus a third from earlier this year, OHA staff did not catch any problems themselves.
Well, it is very interesting just in terms of looking at, okay, what started the state down the path of revoking grants. And in these two most recent cases, as well as a third one that happened in May, it really required an internal employee at the agency or someone from the community raising concerns and filing a complaint with the health authority, which is all very interesting because even though the health authority oversees the expenditures and requires reports, they still needed additional complaints to be filed from people raising concerns about services not getting out the way they're supposed to.
Huh, how about that? So the OHA may need to step up its review process. What do you think? The timeline of those complaints is also interesting. In the most recent cases, the complaints arrived in May, saying the money was being mismanaged and failing to help people, but OHA investigated for 4 months and the money continued to flow while they were investigating. And the cases here in Portland seem especially egregious, with a former employee of Bright Transition saying they were horrified at the way the money was being used.
That case is very interesting just because you had a multitude of issues that really raised questions just about overall business practices. You have the fact that the recovery house, the mortgage was in the name of the organization's nonprofit director, that organization's director. You have the fact that they couldn't provide any insurance documentations, even though the health authority asked 5 times. So really, there were certainly a combination of things that are definitely red flags and really made that particular case stand out.
Yeah, sounds like huge red flags. Botkin's article goes into further detail, including a visit to the recovery home in Northeast Portland and what he was told when he knocked on the door. You can read it all about that, as well as why a faith-based provider in Eastern Oregon had its grant yanked as well. Just head to OregonCapitalChronicle.com. It's a great organization. Lots of great reporting done there. I read them almost every day. Keeping on the Measure 110 beat for a moment, a new study commissioned by the CDC shows no link between the decriminalization of hard drugs and a decrease or an increase in that case in fatal overdoses. Let's explain that. The study was published today in a peer-reviewed medical journal called JAMA Psychiatry. The idea behind it is to test the theory that decriminalizing hard drugs could reduce fatal overdoses by encouraging people to call for help, since they would be no longer facing criminal consequences. So the researchers worked to figure out whether decriminalization had any impact on deadly overdoses. They looked at only fatal overdoses from February of 2021 to March of 2022 here in Oregon. That was the first year 110 was in effect. And then they compared those numbers with fatal overdoses in states where possession of hard drugs is still illegal. So pretty much every other one. And they found that even though overdoses were up in Oregon, they were also up in several other states as well, likely because of the cheap, deadly fentanyl. The authors wrote, the findings of this study suggest that legal changes to remove or decrease criminal penalties for drug possession are not associated with the fatal drug overdose rate 1 year post-implementation. Further research is needed to examine the medium and long-term consequences of these legal changes. Perhaps there are consequences still to come because of Measure 110 if it stays the way it is now, but as the saying goes, time will tell. Coming up next on The Story, you may or may not have heard of the emerald ash borer by now, but you know what? There's a new species of bug that's targeting Oregon's oak trees. It's much harder to spot than its emerald counterpart. Environmental reporter Cale Williams shows us the signs that you should be watching out for and what, if anything, you can do about it when The Story returns. Experts are growing concern for oak trees in Oregon, and it's not because of chainsaws. The problem is an invasive beetle the size of a sesame seed. It's been found in multiple trees in our area, and when it finds an oak that it likes, it almost always kills the tree. Environmental reporter Cale Williams tagged along with a state expert to track these little pests and show you what to watch for.
It's the little guys that are the killers. Mediterranean oak borer.
That's Christine Buell, a forest entomologist with the Oregon Department of Forestry.
Xyloborus monographus.
And she's talking about the Mediterranean oak borer, a minuscule beetle.
Yeah.
That could cause big problems for one of Oregon's iconic tree species. Native to Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, the beetle was found in California in 2017. Then a few turned up in traps in Oregon the following year, but it doesn't appear that they came from our neighbor to the south.
We suspect that the populations that we have found came from Germany, which is different from the populations that have entered California.
The first trees to show signs of infestation weren't discovered until earlier this year. One in Troutdale and several in Wilsonville.
Likely this one.
And that's where we met Buell as she inspected a stately oak that showed signs of infestation.
But the fact that we're seeing dieback and the frass, it's likely Mediterranean oak borer.
The beetles bore into the bark of oak trees and create tunnels inside called galleries.
This is where the bark is, and then the galleries start, they cut in, and then they branch off like a tree, and they're all black.
But it's not the bugs themselves that can cause all the damage. It's the fungus they spread as they move through the tree.
It's an oak wilt, and basically what that does is it interrupts the xylem. So xylem are the straws that bring in water and translocate it throughout the tree. So it basically will cut off the ability of those vessels to translocate water.
Cut off from water, the tree's limbs start to die. And if enough of them do, the tree itself is pretty much done for. Buell said the state is particularly concerned about the beetles because oak trees are well suited to weather warming temperatures and dry spells.
They're really drought tolerant, so in a time of climate change, this is a really great optimal tree that we can plant on our landscape.
Now, people with oaks around their homes should start by taking a close look at their trees.
Right at the end of this pen.
The holes themselves are only about 1/16 of an inch, so they can be hard to spot.
Yeah, it's all this lighter stuff.
But the bugs create a fine, light-colored powder when they dig, called frass.
Here, I can kind of flake it up.
And if a tree is infested, usually leaves will start to brown and die along entire limbs near the crown of the tree.
And so we do want people to report if they see any of those symptoms, any sort of large-scale dieback, and then the pale boring dust on the tree.
There's still a lot of unanswered questions about how the beetles spread, whether they only attack sick trees,
But,
and if infestations are always fatal. One thing the experts are sure of, though, is that the best way to protect Oregon's oaks is to keep the pests from spreading.
But when you have an invasive insect that comes into an area, there really isn't a whole lot that you can do to eradicate, if anything at all. But slowing the spread is effective. There are a lot of strategies, and so we're tackling that head on.
Cale Williams, KGW News.
I love oaks. Get away from our oak trees. Coming up next on this story, requesting a trade from the Portland Trail Blazers superstar, Damian Lillard is now on the move. Where he's going, plus a look into the KGW vault at some of his most memorable moments, coming up right after this. No, it's not a surprise, but yes, definitely the end of an era in Rip City. You've probably heard by now, Trailblazers superstar Damian Lillard on the move, heading to the Milwaukee Bucks as part of a 3-team deal. Dame, as he's been known here, leaves as one of the most beloved Portland athletes. He spent 11 seasons in Portland. He certainly gave us some memorable moments through the years, from draft day to playoff series winning shots. Let's highlight a few of these from the KGW Vault.
The Portland Trailblazers select Damian Lillard of Weber State University.
Damian Lillard's a 6'3" point guard who played 4 years at Weber State. He averaged more than 24 points a game, plus 5 rebounds and 4 assists.
He's a great compliment to LaMarcus Aldridge. I mean, there's a very good chance for a half-court pick-and-roll team, and this is one of the best pick-and-roll point guards to come out in recent memories.
I'm just excited about what I can bring to those guys, how I can play off of them and what I can bring to the table.
Lillard for the win.
Yes! Lillard wins it! And the Trailblazers advance!
Lillard, long-range three.
It's good!
God, it just makes me smile looking at those. How about you? Now it's your turn. What are some of your favorite Lillard memories, both on the court and maybe off? Send us an email, will you? The address is thestory@kgw.com, or call and leave a voicemail. The phone number 503-226-5090. We love hearing and getting your feedback. It's what makes this show unique throughout the Northwest. Please send us your thoughts. That's the end of our show. Thanks for watching. And remember, the story, our collective story, that never ends. The good stuff coming up next.